Greetings and welcome to Daniel chapter 7, part 1. This is lesson 9 in the Sunday School series. This is the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. Subtitle, if you like, The Four Beasts and the Little Horn. By way of a reminder, it's this Friday, so March the 4th, they get together at my house. Because of the number of people, we're right now at about 20. I'm going to go ahead and smoke a brisket and half of a Boston butt. Tim's going to be smoking salmon. It's going to be great food. If you're catching this video and you're not coming, please don't worry about signing up. Just come on Friday. Again, not a shotgun start, but we'll get started around 6 p.m. So we're looking forward to having a great time in the Lord. That's Friday, March the 4th. Also this Friday, the movie that we'll be watching, if I can get it to come up, is Escape from Darkness. Again, everyone voted and this won out. Really the story of this radical Muslim who came to faith in Jesus Christ, and how his wife and children came to faith in Jesus Christ as well. Fascinating story. I think you will enjoy it. Just by way of reminder, if you're interested in getting things from me during the week, I typically 2 to 3 times a week post things on our target text. And if you friend me on YouVersion, you can actually see those. So to track me down, just search for Rich Turner, one big word, Rich Turner at windstream.net. That's my old email address. I've had the app for a while. But again, what you'll do is when I post those things, it'll just allow you to kind of be walking through the text and get a couple updates from me during the week if you're interested in something like that. So off topic for 1 second, but it's really, as we think about the Roman Empire, it's part of the topic for today. On the video, I really have a picture of the expanse of the Roman Empire, roughly around 100 AD, so just shortly after Christ died. And we talked about the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire, which was much bigger. Well, the Roman Empire, which is much bigger, you can see it reaches all the way to Britain, all the way to the United Kingdom. And so as you think about the Roman Empire, it's there that I want to take us today, in particular, to the city of Cambridgeshire. This is a city about 73 miles north of London. 2 years ago, and it's just coming out because of COVID, they were doing some excavations. I think they were getting ready to build some apartment buildings, and they found some graves that dated back to the Roman occupation, around 100 to 300 AD. In one of those graves, they found a skeleton, and they found this in the heels of that skeleton, this 1900-year-old skeleton. This is proof positive, yet again, of the Roman form of execution. You can see the nail is driven into the side of the heel. So again, don't picture the feet being crossed over and nailed through the center of the feet. More than likely, the feet were nailed to the sides of the cross, so that a person could pick themselves up to get air. It would have been a horrific way to die. To the best of my knowledge, we've only found one other skeleton with nails in the heels like this, and that was in Jerusalem. So this is quite a find. It reminds us, especially as we go today, not only of the Lord Jesus Christ and the accuracy of the scriptures, it reminds us of the barbarity, of the horrific power and grotesque power of the Roman Empire. And that's going to come up today. And so I thought this was sort of appropriate, and so I just threw that in, although it is off topic. But we did throw it into the Sunday School, so I didn't want to not throw it here. So the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. As we come today, I need to do something a little different, and that's first a Bible prophecy primer. Now, if you were here and you remember, I gave a lesson right before Christmas. There was only a small number of folks in the class because of the Christmas holidays about prophecies. And one of the things I said is that many prophecies have a literal, earthly, small fulfillment and a literal, spiritual, heavenly, more important, ultimate fulfillment, or they have a dual fulfillment. One that is quite earthly, although it's literal, it's important, but then the other one that's pointing to the gospel, that's pointing to Christ, that's pointing to the final kingdom, that's more significant, much more important, that ultimate fulfillment. So I wanted to remind you of that point, especially today as we now come to Daniel chapter 7, and we shift, and I'll talk about this in a moment, from the historical narrative portion of the book to the apocalyptic, to the these vision and dreams, these prophecies given in apocalyptic form here in Daniel 7 and on. So with that in mind, just a quick prophecy primer. Forgive the picture there. Let me move that out of the way a little bit. So Matthew 2:14 and 15, you'll be very familiar with this text. And he, that's Joseph, rose and took the child, that's Jesus, and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son, Hosea 11 verse 1. And so again, as we read that verse in Hosea, we would say, just if we read just verse 1, and that's what I told the class to do, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And we say, yeah, that's amazing. God called his son, Jesus Christ, out of Egypt, and he prophesied it hundreds of years in advance through the prophet Hosea. But let's continue to read the prophecy now. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. What? They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim, that's another name for Israel, to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and fed them. They shall not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king, because they have refused to return to me. The sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me, and though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. Here is the prophecy from Hosea that in its historical grammatical context, as we just read these first 7 verses, it's clearly against the nation of Israel, who God led by the hand out of Egypt, who God cared for, who God loved, who God fed, and they rebelled against him. And so he promises Assyrian captivity for them because of their sins, and he fulfilled this in 722 AD. 722 BC. I did that earlier today. 722 BC, he fulfilled that promise of judgment upon the nation. Well, so what do we make of this? Well, this is a prophecy of dual fulfillment. You see, the first fulfillment was historical, literal, natural. The smaller fulfillment, the bigger fulfillment, the grander fulfillment, the fulfillment that involved the Messiah, only involved verse 1, or to state it differently, it only involved a portion of the overall prophecy. It's important to understand that before God called Jesus out of Egypt, before that happened, before he sent him into Egypt and called him out, no one would have connected any part of this prophecy to a messianic prophecy. No one would have said this is also about Jesus. And all of it was not about Jesus, just a small portion of it, and this is very common. This is what makes prophecies amazing, their depth, their intricacy. It also makes understanding the future and being dogmatic about the future quite hard, because you wouldn't have even seen this until it happened. So let's look at another one, much like that one. You're familiar with this. I just kept going in Matthew 2:16 through 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, so the wise men had promised to come back, they did not, he became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Now again, as Matthew quotes this prophecy from Jeremiah, we see this is a prophecy about what Herod did and how he killed all the baby children in Bethlehem and the surrounding regions, and it was prophesied in Jeremiah. Again, if we think about our study, Jeremiah was a contemporary to Daniel. This is hundreds of years in advance. You know, we're talking 500 years in advance. So this is absolutely amazing, of course. Now let's go look at the prophecy. So going to Jeremiah 31, where Matthew referred to, and just look at verse 15. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Now there it is. There's the prophecy we just saw. But now let's keep reading verse 16. Thus says the Lord. Keep your voice from weeping. What? Why, Lord? Why would I keep my voice from weeping? And your eyes from tears? Why, Lord? For there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, Yahweh, and your children shall come back to their own country. In the historical, grammatical, literal fulfillment of this prophecy, Jeremiah was prophesying how the women wept as these people, droves of children, were taken off into captivity, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And here the prophet says, don't weep. God is going to bring them back. God is going to bring them back to their own country. Now, it would take 70 years, and he did prophesy that, but you get the point. This prophecy is amazing. It's incredible, and God did it. But nestled within this prophecy, at just a portion of this prophecy, is what Herod was going to do, which was going to call weeping for the women in the area of Bethlehem. And Ramah is on about 5 miles from Bethlehem on the deportation route. And so this is another dual fulfillment prophecy, but you wouldn't have seen this second one until it happened. It was couched there, and so let's draw some conclusions that we need to carry forward with us from here. Some of these prophecies have dual fulfillment, earthly, literal, physical, smaller fulfillment, but a fulfillment nonetheless, one that's amazing, but a more important spiritual, more related to the kingdom of Christ, more related to the gospel fulfillment, that's only often a portion of the prophecy. Now, of course, we're not talking about all prophecies. Some prophecies, many prophecies. Some prophecies that are clearly about the Messiah, that's what they're about, period. Another thing we see is the ultimate, the more important prophecy is hidden away. It's tucked in language that we don't recognize it until it happens. Also, the major prophecy is couched in language that gives the appearance at initial blush of only that earthly fulfillment. And so I want you to take these things away, because this is part of what makes looking at prophecy, especially as it's related to the end times, especially as we talk about apocalyptic prophecy, which is even more complex, and we'll explain that in a minute. That's why some people disagree. That's why many people disagree on some things. Understand it's not always as clear as we would like it to be. Understand that sometimes we're thinking part of the future prophecy is really not part of the future prophecy. Like Matthew 24, it really is very complex. And I want us to appreciate that as we hit Daniel 7 through 12. Not that it cannot be understood, not that we not get the key points from it, but that some of these nuances we may indeed miss. Now, as we come to Daniel chapter 7, we're still in the city of Babylon. Let me get my picture back up at the top corner. So we're still in the city of Babylon. Again, I'm not going to say much today. We've got a lot of other content to cover, but this is a fortified city, a triple gated city. The gates are 40 foot tall, three walls thick. I said triple gates, triple walls. This is the Edamananke. Again, that's more than likely the Tower of Babel that Nebuchadnezzar cleaned up and put the temple to Marduk on the top of. This is a beautiful place. This is a powerful place. This is a place loaded with pagan temples. This place is very, very pagan. Here's another artist's rendition. You can see the Euphrates as it goes through the city, and also it's moated around the city. You can see the northern palace, the southern palace. You can see there's the Edamananke. This is the processional way. We'll look at that in a moment. There's the Ishitar Gate. All of this, we're still back in Babylon. But it's important to understand that we are taking a step backwards in time. In Daniel chapter 6, it was around 537 BC. So we said it was probably around the second year, give or take a little bit, of the reign of Darius the Mede. So again, definitely from 539 to the latest is probably 536. So we'll just put it at 537 and nail it down. That's where we were at the end of chapter 6. As we come into chapter 7, we are in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. So we're no longer in the Medo-Persian kingdom. We've stepped back into the Babylonian kingdom in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. So we've taken a step backwards of roughly 20 years. As we come to Daniel chapter 7, we cross multiple dividing lines in Daniel. Obviously, there's 12 chapters and we've completed 6. There's this natural dividing line. But there's this second dividing line, and that's the content of the chapters, or more specifically, the genre of the chapters. In the first 6 chapters, it was principally historical narrative. They were the court stories of Babylon and Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There was the story of the golden statue, the fiery furnace, the handwriting on the wall, the lion's den. It was historical narrative that covered the span from 605 BC all the way to the fall of the kingdom under Belshazzar and into, like I said, probably the first 2 years of Darius the Mede. So it covered from 605 BC to 537 BC. And again, it was principally historical narrative with some prophecy mixed in. As we come to the second 6 chapters, it's a totally different genre referred to as apocalyptic literature. Now, although you've probably heard this term, the Revelation, for example, is apocalyptic literature, you may not have sort of a working definition of what it means. Well, it's prophecy. It's often prophecy focused on the end times, but it's prophecy where the truths are taught with imagery and graphic symbols. So it's prophecy taught in like a movie where the person experiencing the vision or the dream is seeing this interactive movie, if you can imagine that, where he's seeing these visions flowing in this powerful imagery, and this imagery typically represents other things. For example, today we're going to see beasts, but we're going to learn that these beasts represent kingdoms. We're going to see horns next week, and we're going to see that these horns more than likely represent kings or maybe kingdoms. But again, what we see is symbols that are teaching us other things. Now, oftentimes, and this is a unique in apocalyptic literature, we find that God will provide in the vision a messenger, and the messenger will be explaining things to the person having the vision. In fact, the person having the vision will often see themselves as asking questions. It's like an interactive, high-resolution movie. Now, this does mean, think of all the things we just said about those 2 prophecies and the potential complexity as we look forward. This does mean interpreting and understanding apocalyptic literature, or stated differently, understanding prophecies that are provided in apocalyptic literature about the future, especially in times, can be extremely complex. And we have to recognize that although we may be fairly certain we've got it, we may not exactly have it all. So I want to make one observation and 3 recommendations for us going forward from 7 to 12. First, the observation. Because of what I've showed you about just 2 prophecies in the dual fulfillment, and how the dual fulfillment in that spiritual piece was smaller, it wasn't all of it, how you couldn't have seen it in advance, and along with now apocalyptic literature, and you've got to catch the signs and the symbols, and you've got to understand what they mean, this explains why so many people have different understandings about some of the things we're going to see in Daniel. There are points where scholars generally agree, and then there are going to be points where there's wide disagreement about nuances and specifics. That's okay. We're going to find there's great agreement on the main thrust of all these prophecies. The disagreement comes in a lot of the nuances and the in-the-weeds stuff and the very specific stuff, but the grand theme, great agreement, and you'll see that. So that's my observation. Now 3 recommendations. That's why in the class we should not be dogmatic with one another. We should recognize that even though it may seem crystal clear to me, it may seem just as crystal clear but different to someone else. They're seeing something different than we are, and we understand why. Number 2, because of all that, we should show grace to one another in areas where the Church of the Living God has not historically totally agreed. And that's definitely some of the stuff we're going to see in Daniel. Again, I think we will find we totally agree on the big picture, the big themes, and maybe some of the smaller stuff we're not sure and we can disagree. It's okay. And then the final recommendation, we should always look for the main point. So as we hit each one of these prophecies, if I'm not telling you this is the thrust, this is the main point, then you need to ask me, Rich, what's the main point? We're digging around in the nuances. We're running rabbits. What's the main point? It's easy for me and many of us to be Bible sleuths and to focus on the minutia and miss the main point altogether. And so we want to make sure that as we hit these prophecies, we are focusing on the main point or in points. And so that's my third recommendation. And by the way, I would ask you to keep all of this in mind as we advance in the book of Daniel. And as you think about divisions, there's another division that we haven't talked about probably since the first week. The Aramaic section of Daniel. So Daniel started in Hebrew. Then it shifted to Aramaic in Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, and it's going to continue in Aramaic until the end of chapter 7. So at the end of chapter 7, it's going to go back to Hebrew. And so we have all these different things happening within the book of Daniel. Also, one other point as we think about this. In Daniel chapter 7, we are no longer flowing through history like the first 6 chapters. We are now jumping around back and forth as Daniel shares with us dreams and visions and things that he is experiencing. Dr. Vadi Bacham said this about our text in his sermon on this text. Here is the great irony. And I'm quoting him, quote, here's the great irony. We go to Daniel chapter 7 and people spend years trying to interpret all the little details of the 4 beasts there in the first paragraph. What is this? What is that? What is the rib? What is the bear? What is this? What is that? We get mired down in all of this trying to figure out where this is coming from and where that is going to. Folks, I'm still quoting him. Read Daniel chapter 7. Where is your attention supposed to go? To the Ancient of Days and to the Son of Man and to the kingdom that will never end. I do not have to know who all of these beasts are. All I have to know is that they are violent and they are ungodly. They're examples of kingdoms that come and kingdoms that go, and I long for the kingdom that has no end. Did you hear what he said? Close quotes. Did you hear what he said about the main focus? Yeah, it's the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man and the kingdom that will never end. That's the main focus of Daniel chapter 7. John MacArthur said this in Daniel chapter 7 in his sermon. Now, what is the theme of the vision? What is the heart and soul of the vision? Simply this, and mark it. The thrust, the theme, the major point of this vision is the coming of the King and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. So as we come today, we're back during the reign of Belshazzar. If we were to relate this back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we are back to the head of gold that represented Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. Again, we were last week in the chest and arms of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire, but we stepped backwards in time, and we still have the Grecian Empire to discuss as well as the Roman Empire to discuss. And so that really sets us up for our lesson today, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. Now, as we come to chapter 7, it divides into 4 movements, 4 scenes, 4 sections. Some theologians say 3. Again, there's really repetition on some scenes. It might be better described as 2, but I like 4 because it's easy to break it in 4 and talk about them, and you see them clearly, although one of them is clearly repetition. And that's the third one. It's a zoom in of the first scene. So let's get going in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them a little horn, another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, as we read these first few verses, they seem abstract. They seem almost disconnected from reality that we live in, but that's the nature of apocalyptic literature. And at first glance, we're like, I have no idea what this means. But as we place ourselves in Daniel's sandals, as we use the Bible to help us understand what's happening, we do find, with many scholars, that we come to a reasonable common understanding about this first scene. One that's fairly common, although not everyone agrees, but it's fairly common within the professing church. Now, does that mean it's not one of those other views? No, it doesn't. We've already talked about that. So I'm just giving you what I believe is my best stab at this. And by the way, this fits well with what other scholars have found. Verse 1, we see it's the first year of Belshazzar. Daniel has this dream. Again, this is 556 BC. If our timeline is correct, Nebuchadnezzar has been dead for 6 years. It's clear from what we learn from Belshazzar by the event of the writing on the wall that Daniel is no longer in a place of prominence. He's slid, if you will, into obscurity. And it's during this time, in the quiet time, where Daniel's moved from this place of prominence in the Babylonian Empire to this sort of in the backdrop where Belshazzar is reigning, that God gives Daniel a dream. We see that Daniel in verse 1 had a dream and he wrote it down. This dream troubled him. We're going to see this dream made him anxious, but God revealed and Daniel wrote. Now it's funny, you do not know what you do not know. And what we did not know is that while Daniel was interpreting dreams and visions for other people, he was having dreams and visions that he could not explain. He was having dreams and visions that were bringing him anxiety. And again, Daniel wasn't interpreting those other dreams because he was so godly or smart or whatever. God was giving him those. But we do learn here in chapter 7 of something that happened earlier in life while Daniel was interpreting other people's dreams. Notice he told the sum of the matter. There's a hint here that not only did he write it down, but he shared it with God's people. He told them about this vision. And so we hit scene 1. He had this vision by night. So it would seem that God is giving him this revelation via a dream as he sleeps. Verse 2b, we see the word behold. The New King James says suddenly. So behold, the four winds of heaven are stirring up the great sea. Now Daniel would have been familiar with the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. And no doubt what he probably is seeing here, notice the word probably, is the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Sea. He's seeing the four winds blowing and stirring the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, into chaos and disorder. But it's important for us to recognize that although he is seeing a sea, the sea represents something else altogether, and that's the nature of apocalyptic literature. The sea is often used to represent mankind or the world. In fact, that's exactly what the angel told John in the Revelation in Revelation 17:15. The angel said, and again, you see in his apocalyptic vision, there's interaction between him and the angels. And that's the nature of apocalyptic literature. It's almost like these people are brought into the vision, which they were. So the angel said to me in Revelation 17:15, the waters that you saw where the prostitute, where the whore was seated, are peoples and multitudes, nations and languages. So Daniel saw an ocean that was churning and boiling, but it represented the sea of humanity, if you will. And these beasts are not coming out of water. They're not wet. They're wet in his vision. But in reality, these beasts, which we will see in a moment what they are coming out of humanity. They're coming out of the world. They're coming out of kingdoms. They are, well, we'll just save that for a minute. It is from this chaos, this disorder, that we're introduced to these four beasts. Now, the Aramaic word just means animals, so we're introduced to these four great animals. Verse 3, Daniel tells us the sum of what he sees. He sees four great beasts come out of the sea, different from one another. Now, at this point, as we've read these beasts, and we now have a sort of a helper on the sea, we might end up anywhere on what these beasts represent. But the good news is, as Daniel is interacting with this angelic person in this vision, in this dream, in Daniel 7:17, he's told what they are. He's asking questions, and the angelic being says these four great beasts are four kings that shall come out of the earth. Now, in the vision, they came out of the sea, but right, they're coming out of the earth, they're coming out of humanity. So now at this point, that's very helpful. We now understand that these beasts represent kings and possibly kingdoms. So again, this is the nature of apocalyptic literature. It's this heavenly message taught by these graphic symbols. There's even this messenger to help explain it as we go. And we see now that these animals represent four kings, or as most scholars believe, four kingdoms. Again, not all would agree on who these four kingdoms are, but most would agree it's four kingdoms. Verse 4, let's look at the first one. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then I looked, and its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the ground, made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. So as you think about this beast, he's a lion, ferocious and powerful. He's an eagle, fast and powerful and ferocious. In fact, both of these animals eat flesh. Both rule their dominion. Here is a lion with eagle's wings. We should be thinking fast, powerful, and indeed even majestic. Now, a lion with eagle's wings, most scholars agree, is Babylon, that strong and powerful and majestic nation represented by the head of gold. Notice the language that seems kind of strange. This lion with the eagle's wings had its wings plucked off. It's lifted from the ground. It's made to stand on its 2 feet like a man, and ultimately the mind of a man is given to it. Now, most people see in that description the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, the 7 periods, more than likely 7 years, but not necessarily, 7 periods of time that passed over him when he lost his mind, when he went insane, until he recognized that God rules in the heaven and on earth. And then his mind was returned to him. His kingdom was returned to him. He was given a man's heart. This is God humbling him when he plucked his wings because of his pride, and God restoring him, and even possibly Nebuchadnezzar's conversion as a man's mind is given to him. Now, there's one other thing you need to understand. The leading image in Babylon is this: the lion with the eagle's wings. Daniel saw this image everywhere, every day. In fact, the processional way, which led through the Ishtar Gate, the main entry to the city, where I told you they had an event once a year where they would go outside the city, they would come through the Ishtar Gate, they would go to the Edamananki, had on both sides these murals of lions with wings. Now, this is not a model or replica, mock-up. This is the actual one side of the wall, dug out of the sand in Babylon, taken to the Pergamon Museum in Germany, and you can go see it there. And that was the only image in the entire processional way. So I think Daniel was very familiar with this first image, and he recognized what we didn't recognize instantly, that this was indeed Babylon. Verse 5, behold another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. That's kind of strange. And it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So again, we're told, behold, or as the New King James says, suddenly a second beast. Now, we don't know if he sees one beast, then he sees the next beast, or if he's seen all of them together. We can't be sure, but they're being fed to him in this movie form. Now, whether they're replacing each other or coming together in one picture, we cannot be sure. But now he sees a massive, powerful bear. A very powerful animal, and this bear looks like he's fresh off consuming another animal, and this bear is bigger on one side than the other side, sort of an odd observation. And it's almost like this bear has been caught in the act of consuming other animals. So if the first beast was a kingdom, and the angel had told him that the beasts were kingdoms, kings or kingdoms, then we know that this second beast is a kingdom. Now, this gets much easier once we've nailed down the first one, because the natural question we should ask ourselves is, okay, what kingdom replaced the Babylonian kingdom? What was the kingdom that came next? And so we know the answer to that. Historically, it's the chest and arms of silver. It's the Medo-Persian Empire. We saw that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. So already we're thinking it's the Medo-Persian Empire. That's what would make sense. Now the weird observation about it being larger on one side or raised up on one side, the Persian portion of the Medo-Persian Empire was much larger and much stronger. It was out of balance, if you will. It was principally a Persian empire with Medes in it. That makes sense and explains why the bear was pictured as the bear was. Now notice the bear had 3 ribs in his mouth. Now, although there's not complete agreement here, many believe that those are the 3 kingdoms that he defeated, he being the bear, the Medo-Persian Empire defeated, to consolidate the empire. Lydia in 546 BC, Babylon in 539 BC, and finally Egypt in 525 BC. Now that may not be it. It may just be that, hey, this is a kingdom eater. But in either case, we are sort of amazed on the small details that seem to line up with history. Verse 6, after this I looked, and behold another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. That's interesting. I thought dominion was given to all of them. We see the behold again, or as the New King James says, suddenly, and all of a sudden Daniel sees the next animal. A leopard, the fastest animal on land, with 4 wings. What does that do? That makes a leopard even faster, and he has 4 heads. That's interesting. That's like the 4 rings. Very interesting. And he's given dominion. A leopard known for its swiftness, and its swiftness is increased here with the addition of 4 wings. Now again, if we take a peek at history and simply ask who defeated the Medo-Persian Empire, without belaboring any details, we know for sure who did it. It was the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great. In fact, the defining moment was the Battle of Arbela on October the 1st, 331 BC. Now, before we say another thing, mark this down. When Daniel gave this prophecy, no one knew who that was. No one said, oh, the leopard? That's the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great. We would have to get there and watch it start coming together and see what happened at the end before this would come together. This is the nature of this apocalyptic literature. You've really got to get there to be sure you got there. No one would have called this in advance. Nobody. No one would have said, when Daniel had this vision, oh yeah, that's the Grecian Empire and Alexander the Great. That would not have happened. And that's important to remember. So again, most scholars agree this is the Grecian Empire. This is Alexander the Great. He took the throne at 20. He conquered a great portion of the known world and was planning his next venture when he was 32 and died in the city of Babylon. Best guesses are poisoning or malaria. He indeed was a leopard with wings that points to how fast he took the known world, how fast he conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, how fast he expanded the kingdom. When you consider how they traveled and the weapons of warfare in those days, it is breathtaking that a man conquered the known world from 20 to 32. Now, the 4 heads is extremely interesting. It's important to note that Alexander the Great did not have a son. He was too busy conquering. He didn't have time to raise children. He did not have a son to turn the kingdom over to. And so at his death, there was an internal struggle, and ultimately the kingdom was split between his 4 generals. Cassandra ruled Greece and Macedonia. Lysimachus ruled Thrace and a large part of Asia Minor. Seleucus governed Syria, Babylon, and much of the Middle East. And Ptolemy controlled, as you can see, Egypt and Palestine. Now, to consider for a moment these beasts and the 4 heads and how this is more than likely showing what happened after Alexander the Great died is shockingly accurate. As I told the class, this is why we have liberals who believe Daniel was written well after the fact, because some of these things contain so much detail that it's embarrassing. God revealed so much that liberal theologians are embarrassed. For the conservative theologian, for the Christian theologian, they're amazed. But they're reminded that our God does as he pleases in the heavens and in the armies and the inhabitants of the earth. But they're amazed at what he revealed through his prophet Daniel. Verse 7. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces. It stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that went before it, and it had 10 horns. This fourth beast, notice, is not described by animals that we're familiar with. It's initially described by adjectives: dreadful, terrible, and very strong. Iron teeth, devouring and breaking and trampling the residue. Now, some believe this animal is like a dragon or a dinosaur. Others believe it was a composite animal. In other words, the composite of the first three. We really have no idea. Well, the idea we should have is it was scary, powerful, terrible, and dreadful. Now again, if we just take a peek at history and ask what kingdom overthrew the Grecian kingdom, yes, it is the Roman kingdom. The kingdom that perfected crucifixion. The kingdom that crucified thousands. In fact, it was the Roman Empire at the Battle of Corinth in 146 AD where the grip that the Grecian Empire had began to slip, and the beginning of the end for the Grecian Empire started, and the Roman Empire continued to rise in power. Most scholars agree this horrific, powerful, monstrous beast is the Roman Empire. Now, it is different than the other animals, and we're not told why, but it's definitely different in the fact that it couldn't be explained with animals, and there's some pieces on it that seem to be significant. The 10 horns, we'll talk about that next week. Those likely correspond, though, to 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's dream that we didn't develop because it wasn't developed for Daniel. Verse 8, and I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As Daniel considered and began to contemplate the nature of the horns, the little horn, he saw this little horn cost the displacement of 3 horns. He sees this little horn has eyes like a man. He sees this little horn is speaking great things. That's the same word for the 4 great beasts that came out of the ocean. So we see it's developed a little bit further from Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but not much. Now at this point, I know we have questions about the 10 horns, and I know we have questions about the little horn. Good news, that's all coming. We're going to talk about those next week because Daniel has questions, and that's going to get the conversation started. But this brings us to the conclusion of scene 1. Scary, probably somewhat confusion. It brought anxiety. This movie with each snapshot or each action picture held for a period of time, and then we see probably the next one. Now, you know my nature is I want to know, what did this look like? So I jumped on the internet, and here's one example of what it looked like. Now, did it look like this? Are these accurate representations of the beast, the lion with the wings, the bear with the ribs, and I guess this is the larger side over here, the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings, and then this dragon with 10 horns and iron claws? Probably not, but it gets us an idea. Or maybe it's this. Again, the lion with wings, the bear, larger on one side. I guess this is the larger side, the arm looks big. The leopard with the 4 wings and the 4 heads, and then the beast with the 10 horns. We don't know, but that brings us to the end of scene 1, and we are introduced to scene 2, verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment. The books were opened. This is the most important verses in Daniel chapter 7. This and what's going to come about the Son of Man are the thrust of Daniel 7. These are the verses that tell us everything we need to know. These verses are some of the most important verses in the Bible. These verses are important theologically. These verses are important eschatologically. This is Judgment Day. These verses are important Christologically as we see in verses to come the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days and what happens next. In the first 8 verses, we saw these wicked kingdoms rise out of the earth, out of the sea. They were scary, horrific, and violent, wicked, and evil. And there's a lesson I want us to catch. These are the kingdoms of the world. They rise out of the chaos in humanity. Another one comes along. Sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's more wicked and more evil, sometimes less. But they're the kingdoms of men. They last for a short time. Ultimately, they will be destroyed. Ultimately, they will be judged by the one who sits on the fiery throne. That's the point as we come here. The wicked kingdoms come out of chaos. They strike fear. Daniel looked down and saw these wicked kingdoms coming out of the sea, but then his gaze is directed upward to the throne room of God. And it's there, we're told, look at it, verse 9, as I looked, thrones, plural, were placed. Now, what in the world is that about? We don't know how many. I'm not going to tell you how many because I don't know. I'll tell you what Revelation 4 verse 2 says. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. We're talking about that right now. And he who sat on the throne was like a jasper and a sardis stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne in the appearance like an emerald. It was absolutely beautiful and amazing. And around the throne were 24 thrones. And on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting clothed in white robes. They had crowns of gold on their head. Was this 24 thrones? We don't know. What are these 24 thrones? It's been speculated that they're the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. It's been speculated that they're 24 representing the Old and New Testament church. We don't know. We understand numbers are sometimes used symbolically, but I want you to see that Daniel saw thrones, but that was nothing, because what he really focused on was the Ancient of Days who was seated on a throne. His garment was white as snow, representing purity and holiness. His hair was white like wool, representing wisdom and purity. Think about those horrific, horrible beasts. Now think about this. We see a righteous king and a righteous kingdom, pure, strong, moral, beautiful, holy. And here's the point. These earthly kingdoms are rising and falling. There's one kingdom that stands above them all, the majestic one, seated on his throne, who is altogether lovely. This is the focus, the kingdom of the Ancient of Days, the kingdom of God. Notice verse 9. His throne is made of fire, fiery flames. Now, this may be a picture of God that we've never imagined before, but in this apocalyptic picture of Judgment Day, God is seated on a throne made of fire. Now, hear me. We're not going to get to heaven and God's seated on a throne of fire. I don't think that's what we're being told. We're being given apocalyptic imagery of Judgment Day. What should strike fear in the hearts of the lost brings great comfort to the hearts of the saved. Now notice in verse 9, there's burning wheels. Now the etymology of this word means to swirl or a whirlwind. So there's one of two ideas here. Either the Ancient of Days is sitting on this like massive chariot throne, a throne that's made of fire. He's like a warrior riding in a chariot, or his throne is pictured with a whirlwind of fire underneath it. Either one's fine. It's awesome. It's incredible. It's amazing. And if we haven't seen enough fire yet, verse 10, a stream of fire is issuing, coming out before him. If scene 1 grabbed our attention, this should even more. We are beholding in picturesque form the throne of the living God as he sits in judgment. By the way, the Ancient of Days, this term is only used by Daniel and only used here in chapter 7, 7:9, 7:13, and 7:22. Only place. Verse 10, you'll notice that 1,000 thousands are serving the Ancient of Days, and 10,000 times 10,000 are standing before him. The court is set in judgment, and the books are open. He is seated on this throne of fire. Fire is coming out before him. There's a whirlwind of fire or wheels of fire below him. This is awesome. Thousands are serving him. Thousands upon thousands are worshiping him, and the books are open. Now, all of this language is very familiar to anyone who's read the New Testament. Revelation 5:11 and 12. I saw and I heard a voice of many angels round about the throne and the living creatures and the elders. And the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands and thousands. And they were saying with a great voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches, wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. More specifically, as we think about judgment, there we just focused on the thousands and thousands around the throne. Revelation 20 verses 11 and 12. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence the earth fled and the sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. Scene 1, the chaos and fake power of these worldly kings and these worldly kingdoms. Scene 2, the serenity and true power of the sovereign of the universe, the King of heaven, the King of glory, the mighty God, the Ancient of Days. God enthroned and surrounding him thousands upon thousands upon thousands. Babylonian Empire, gone. Medo-Persian Empire, gone. Grecian Empire, gone. Old Roman Empire, gone. No nation stayed here but the kingdom of God. This is the only kingdom that will stand the test of time. It's the only righteous kingdom. This is the kingdom of God. This was Daniel's focus. This is the focus of Daniel 7. This throne that stands above all thrones. We talked about in the class, so I'll mention it here. As you think about this, Daniel was able to serve the Babylonian Empire, yet never compromise his service to God. God steps in and wipes the Babylonian Empire off the planet, and we're the Medo-Persian Empire. And Daniel is able to serve the Medo-Persian Empire, and unless they call him to violate the laws of his God, he serves them quite faithfully. In fact, so faithfully that his earthly masters feel like they can't get it done without him. That's a good lesson for us as we serve our God and we work in a world for people who may not be saved. We should do all things like we're doing them for Christ. And up and until the point when they call us to violate God's laws, we should give our all for the advance of our nation, the all for the advance of our employer. And meanwhile, the whole time giving our all for the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, because I am a visual person, I apologize in advance. Did it look like that? Yeah, I know. This is the best you can do with graphics. It would have been so amazing. This is not even close. But you can see the books are open. You can see there's thrones. You can see there's thousands upon thousands. You can see the fiery wheels. You can see the fiery throne. Or did it look like this? Here, seated on the throne, books are open. You can see the fire coming from the throne. You can see the wheel platter spinning below. You can see the thousands upon thousands. You see the angelic host. Again, probably not even close. I get it. It was amazing. It was incredible. It was beautiful. It was the throne room of God set for Judgment Day. We now come to scene 3. Verse 11. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, its body destroyed, and it given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As he is watching this, as he sees the rise of the little horn, as he hears him speaking great words, we're expecting a whole lot of story, and here's the story. The beast that had the horns is killed, his body is destroyed, and he's thrown into the fire. So much for the mean trampling beast. So much for the 10 horns, the 3 horns that were uprooted, the little horn that was boasting and bragging. He watches, and this animal is simply destroyed. Suddenly, without warning, without elaboration, the beast is killed and his body is destroyed. This is a stark reminder that our God reigns. That is the point of chapter 7. Don't look at the outward appearance. Our God reigns. With the eye of faith, recognize that a sovereign God is behind the swirl. He's behind the chaos, and he's working a plan even though we may not see it. The beast, all beasts, will be destroyed. The final horrific beast with the horns and even the final belligerent little horn will be destroyed. And you notice in verse 12 it says, their dominion is taken away, but their lives will prolong for a season and a time, or 1.5. It seems that at least a consensus point is that when the kingdoms were destroyed, it's not like all the people were destroyed. They were just absorbed into the new kingdom. And so that's the idea of their lives being prolonged. But we don't know, and we surely wouldn't argue about, an abstract point like that. And that brings us to the end of our lesson, and so I will simply introduce our text for next week. We'll set some, obviously, introductory comments, but we'll pick up here next week. I'll just read it, no comment. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, the one seated on that fiery throne, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion. This is to the Ancient of Days. Dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. There's what it's all about. And we're going to pick up there, Lord willing, next week. Until we meet next Sunday, hopefully we meet Friday at the get-together, next Sunday in church as we pick back up here in verse 13, or on YouTube if you're not able to make it. I pray that the Lord would bless you, keep you, make his face to shine upon you, show you his grace. And again, I present to you Daniel chapter 7, really verses 1 through 12. Thank you.